Hello, and welcome to History 2023, Arkansas History. Lecture title, From Territory to State. As the American settlers carved homes and livelihoods out of the Arkansas wilderness in the early 19th century, they were also striving to establish a functioning political society for their new home once it was organized as a territory in 1819. As I alluded to in the last video, early Arkansas politics would frequently be turbulent and, on occasion, downright bloody, but it was characterized above all by two things: the effort to set up a government that would respond to the needs of its citizens and satisfy the ambitions of those who ran it, and putting the territory on the path to statehood. One of the first problems facing the territorial government was a fairly serious one: finding people to form a territorial government with. The early settlers were very much interested in having one, but since Arkansas was at this time a territory, senior positions like that of governor were not chosen by popular elections, but by presidential appointment, often of presidential friends and supporters from across the nation. And many of the men appointed to those positions, as it turned out, weren't really that interested in coming to Arkansas to fill them. Two of the first three judges appointed for the territory, for example, left after no more than a couple months, though they did make sure to draw their salaries first. And the first governor, James Miller of New Hampshire, a hero of the War of 1812, did not arrive in Arkansas Post until late December 1819, nearly 6 months after Arkansas had officially become a territory. Though he held the job another 5 years and got a few things done during that time, it was under his watch that the capital was officially moved to Little Rock, and he also worked to improve the civil administration and maintain peaceful relations between the remaining Indian tribes. He clearly did not enjoy it, and spent the majority of his tenure back home in New England, pleading ill health before finally resigning in December 1824. Absenteeism, even among such senior officials as these, was not exactly uncommon or limited to Arkansas alone. As we saw in the last lecture, the frontier wasn't what you'd call a popular destination for people in the more civilized eastern states, and if you could stay away from your job for months at a time, then why not? In the case of Miller, though, his absence was fairly significant in that it left political affairs largely in the hands of his secretary, what we would call a lieutenant governor today, Robert Crittenden, who would be one of the more controversial figures in early Arkansas history. The younger brother of a Kentucky senator, which was how he got the job in the first place, Crittenden was only 22 at the time of his appointment, but he was highly intelligent and self-confident, with lofty goals for himself and Arkansas, though in which order was one of the many arguments concerning him. During Miller's absences, Crittenden was in effect acting governor, and he took full advantage of the opportunity, organizing the first territorial legislature and making appointments for a treasurer and auditor, for circuit judges, and for local officials in the various counties. By the end of 1819, even before Miller showed up for the first time, he had already managed the election of a territorial delegate to Congress, the previously mentioned James Bates. He also maneuvered behind the scenes to get the Quapaw tribe evicted from its lands along the Arkansas River, which wasn't exactly a nice thing to do, but it was definitely popular with the settlers. Understandably then, Crittenden was regarded by many as a competent and constructive, even progressive leader for the new territory. There were just as many people, though, whom he rubbed the wrong way. Though sometimes sloppy in his administration, and that did raise eyebrows on occasion, what really bothered them was his intense ambition. He rarely bothered informing Miller or the federal government of his actions, and half the time appeared to be using his position mainly to build a power base that could propel him to higher office. Supporters in this coalition included Tennessee native Henry Conway, who would replace Bates as territorial delegate to Congress in 1823, and Conway's, various relatives, including William Rector, Arkansas's first surveyor general. In the end, though, Crittenden's reach exceeded his grasp, or however that old metaphor goes. Complaints over these negative aspects of his behavior had filtered up to Washington, and after Governor Miller resigned in 1824, the feds chose as his replacement George Izard, a South Carolina native and another War of 1812 hero. Though he had more of a right to claim ill health than Miller, he would in fact die in office in November 1828 at only 52 of complications from gout. Izard was not only in Little Rock for most of his tenure as governor, he was also unwilling to let Crittenden run the show for him. The two clashed as a result, and Izard, who proved better at political maneuvering, managed to turn many of the secretary's supporters against him. This included the extended Conway clan. Conway himself ran for Congress in 1827 and won despite Crittenden's opposition. Now, that didn't work out well for him personally, as the fallout from the election included a duel between the two men, in which Conway was fatally wounded, but it didn't work out well for Crittenden either. Much of the political elite in Arkansas, to the extent one existed, was now firmly against him, and soon began using what influence it had in Washington to muscle him out altogether. After Izard's death, the new president, Andrew Jackson, appointed a political ally of his, John Pope, another Kentucky politician, as the territory's third governor, frustrating Crittenden's ambitions once again, and in 1829 replaced him as secretary with an army buddy, William Fulton. Though he never gave up seeking a return to public office before his early death in 1834, Crittenden's direct role in Arkansas politics was effectively over after this point, though the faction of supporters he created would survive his fall and be influential through the 1830s. The tenure of Arkansas's third governor would see the emergence of a new balance of power of sorts. Very laid back in his personality, often regarding himself as more of a planter than a professional public servant, John Pope seemed to many the perfect representation of the frontier with its lack of formality and sophistication, though there was disagreement on whether or not these were desirable traits in a territorial governor. One English traveler passing through Little Rock complained that he had gone to call on Pope, only to be told the man was out in the street looking for his wife's lost pigs. On the other hand, he did work to make the capital city a bit more respectable, organizing the construction of the first Capitol building. Completed in 1842, it is now known as the Old State House and is the oldest surviving building of its kind west of the Mississippi. So maybe this reputation is a bit unfair, but it was the reputation he got nonetheless. Like Izard before him, he tried to play the political game, but much less successfully in the end. One of the most significant legacies of Pope's tenure was that he aligned himself with the Conway family and its many supporters. Its previous leader, Henry Conway, was of course dead now, courtesy of Crittenden, but others were now on the scene, including his younger brothers, James and Elias, his cousin Ambrose Sevier, and members of other families related by blood or marriage, such as the Rectors and the Johnsons. All young, talented, and ambitious men, they supported Pope and were rewarded with any number of political positions. James Conway became the new Surveyor General. Ambrose Sevier, now the de facto head of the faction, was the new representative to Congress, and others received jobs as judges, marshals, Indian agents, and so on. By the mid-1830s, the Conway, Sevier, Rector, Johnson family league, often simply referred to as the dynasty, was firmly entrenched in Arkansas government, and it would be the dominant force in political life right up to the eve of the Civil War. Pope's elevation of the dynasty came at the expense of others also seeking those offices, though, and soon enough he was facing a number of opponents. William Woodruff, the editor of the Arkansas Gazette, one of the territory's first newspapers, some of the remaining members of the old Crittenden faction, and his own secretary, William Fulton, who, moreover, had a direct line to President Jackson to communicate his discontent. In a move that would have made Crittenden green with envy, I'm sure, Fulton managed to engineer Pope's removal from office in 1835 and get himself appointed in his place as Arkansas's fourth and, as it happened, last territorial governor. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if, despite its genuine significance and the occasional duel to spice things up, what I've just been reciting comes across to some as a little tedious. The list of governors shuffling in and out, who happens to be backstabbing whom at a given moment. But these things always find their way into the accounts of Arkansas's early history, partly because, apart from their political conniving, members of the territorial government weren't doing a lot else. A legislature now met regularly, composed of elected representatives, and most of the administrative positions were filled, but the amount of actual lawmaking, year over year, was usually pretty small. Some of the most essential work was done, such as setting up a tax system and creating a law code to regulate slavery, and officials paid attention to issues of local government by carving out more and more counties for more efficient service and administration. Although even then, it sometimes seemed they were as concerned about raising their own public visibility as much as anything else. Of the 31 counties in Arkansas by 1836, some would have the names of geographical features, Hot Springs, St. Francis, and others the names of early American leaders, Washington, Jefferson, Greene, Pulaski, but a good many honored the politicians we've just looked at: Crittenden, Conway, Pope, Sevier, and, of course, Izard, formed in 1825. But in other respects, from the vantage of hindsight, it would seem that Arkansas's leaders in the territorial era fell down on the job. The most obvious example of this was infrastructure. Though the region had plenty of navigable rivers for transportation and commerce, some of them, especially the Red, were choked with debris and other obstructions, and in the highlands and lowlands alike, good roads were often an absolute necessity. However, the government took little positive action on this front, beyond sending frequent petitions to Washington for federal public works projects in order to improve the local infrastructure. In other words, you guys take care of it. The feds did, indeed, pour some money and labor into Arkansas for this purpose. As early as 1824, the so-called Military Road began to be constructed between Little Rock and the Mississippi River town of Hopefield, a forerunner to today's West Memphis, and during the 1830s, the Red River obstructions were cleared away. But given the small size of the federal government itself, it was not about to spend money to connect every single town, and neither, it seemed, were the men in Little Rock. This was one reason, though certainly not the only one, why large parts of Arkansas, in the 1830s and even long afterward, seemed to many not much more than wilderness, and the territory turned state as a whole self-sufficient without being exactly prosperous. Now, in fairness to the politicians, it wasn't as though building infrastructure themselves and other kinds of government action would have been easy. Since, as I said before, most Arkansas residents were engaged in subsistence agriculture, there wasn't a huge amount of cash or taxable income floating around, and part of the reason they kept asking Washington to carry out these projects on their behalf was that they simply didn't have the funds for it to do themselves. Moreover, even if they could be a tad hypocritical about it at times, most of the public officials, as well as their constituents, believed very strongly in the idea of minimal government. Many national leaders of the era, such as Thomas Jefferson and now Andrew Jackson, championed a vision of America as a land of independent planters and small farmers, the true backbone of civilization and virtue. Their independence protected by a government too small to do much more than make sure the lights stayed on. It might not give them everything they wanted, but it wouldn't take everything they had either. In the states and territories of the South and West especially, people liked this notion. And while they didn't adhere to it 100% in practice, there was nonetheless a widespread aversion to the idea of an activist, interventionist, spendthrift government on whatever level. Arkansas was no exception, and so it's no surprise that its leaders, from a mixture of principle and political self-preservation, weren't too interested in carrying out public improvements themselves, or, more to the point, levying the higher taxes those would require. So the image one might have of them as a bunch of lazy cheats is kind of exaggerated. Though I wouldn't say it's totally exaggerated. The constant request for federal money did appear a bit self-serving even then, and with the extreme confusion in land titles and other property rights that I mentioned last time, there's no doubt that many public officials were putting at least as much effort into taking advantage of the situation and enriching themselves as they were into actually governing. From the gubernatorial level on down, regardless of political faction, these men were using their position to fix the market at every turn, buying up huge amounts of public land and then selling it for massive profits, the sort of thing that would get them all jailed today. Assuming, that is, our justice system works better now than it did then, which, meh. Here too, though, since ordinary Arkansans were resorting to squatting and any other illegal means of possessing land that wasn't theirs, it's hard to rake their politicians over the coals too much for this behavior. Getting good and profitable land for cheap was the goal of just about everyone in frontier society, and it was hardly surprising that people would cut corners to get it. The slow pace of Arkansas's development and the limited resources and activity of its government were one factor in the debate that started to pop up around the year 1830. How soon should Arkansas apply for statehood as a full and equal member of the Union? Opinion on this question was by no means unanimous. Typically, Congress required territories to have populations of somewhere between 40 and 60,000 before admitting them as states, and while Arkansas seemed likely to cross that threshold sometime during the next decade, it would in fact surge to 98,000 in the 1840 census, more than tripling its 1830 figure, it still had enough of the frontier about it that admission was not exactly a foregone conclusion. During the early 1830s, advocates of immediate statehood tended to be found among the Crittenden faction, who used the numbers game to argue that Arkansas was already too large to be a territory much longer, that the prestige of statehood would stimulate further economic development and thus eliminate some of the existing problems, and that the people deserved full self-government rather than continue in shackles, as one called it, to the federal authorities. On the other hand, the Conway-Sevier Party, or just the dynasty, was largely in opposition at first, expressing more pessimism on the question of population growth and ridiculing the notion that Arkansas was suffering under the jackboot of Washington. If anything, they replied, federal oversight was a lifeline. If Arkansas became a state and had to pay for its own government upkeep and infrastructure, it would either collapse or have to impose incredibly high taxes. Since neither scenario, unmitigated paradise or unmitigated disaster, came to pass entirely in the end, it's hard to say who was right, or more right than the other, though on a coin flip, I would suggest that the dynasty was maybe on stronger ground with its arguments. Ultimately, though, as had happened so many times before, Arkansas's future was decided in large part by events beyond its borders. Since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, if not before, sectional rivalries between North and South, plus the slavery question, had produced an unwritten rule in the U.S. Congress. The number of free states in the Union would be balanced by the number of slave states. This rule would in time break down, and that in turn would help push the country down the path to the Civil War, but at the moment it was still very much in force. Following the admission of Missouri, there were 12 free states and 12 slave states, meaning the next free territory to become a state would need to be balanced by a slave territory or vice versa. By the mid-1830s, Michigan had reached the threshold for statehood and was applying for admission, and this convinced many Arkansas leaders that they should seize the opportunity and be the ones to maintain the balance. Even members of the dynasty came around. Ambrose Sevier, who had previously spoken out against the idea, now stated that this was the time to act. If they waited further, Florida might get in ahead of them, and there was no telling when another free territory would apply and give them another opportunity. There were a few more hurdles to jump through. In Congress, some abolitionists objected to the idea of any more slave states entering the Union, but the slavery question was not yet the all-consuming issue it would later become, and this was quickly brushed aside. The state constitution was written up in the autumn of 1835, electoral maps for the state house and senate districts were prepared, and after all this activity was given the final seal of approval in D.C., Arkansas officially entered the Union on June 15, 1836, as its 25th state. I'd blow a noisemaker if I had one right now. Statehood was, as you might expect, widely celebrated in Arkansas, and I have no doubt a lot of the politicians gave a lot of eloquent speeches about how much their new state had progressed and how a bright and glorious future lay ahead, yada, yada, yada. And as supporters had predicted, there would indeed be a lot of improvements in the next quarter century. But, as opponents had predicted, there would also be a lot of growing pains to accompany these. Arkansas might be a state now, but it was still pretty small, it still lacked a decent infrastructure, and much of it was still in something approaching frontier conditions. It would be the job of the new state government to remedy the many problems as best it could. Next, we'll begin our look at the period sometimes known as antebellum Arkansas and the further political, social, and cultural changes that would occur between the moment of statehood and the onset of the Civil War.